My name is Marty Case. I'm the author of The Relentless Business of Treaties, How Indigenous Land Became U.S. Territory. This video is an overview of the introduction to that book. And the central premise of that, the central point I wanted to make in that introduction, is that U.S. Indian treaties were nation-to-nation agreements. This point is critical to understanding what the treaties were, what happened in the treaty process, but it's often a source of confusion in public discourse. And this is, I think, primarily because the U.S. is such a racialized society. The treaties are often presented as these binary agreements with the U.S., primarily white people, on one side, and Indians on the other. But these are not interracial agreements. They're diplomacy among scores of sovereign nations. And once you get that, several other aspects of treaty making and legacies of treaty making make a little more sense. One misconception that it clears up is that the land cession treaties by which indigenous nations transferred control of territory to the U.S. were not real estate deals. They were not situations in which one party buys land from another. Instead, they were an indigenous nation ceding its territory to another sovereign nation. And because those indigenous nations weren't constructed on a foundation of property, it couldn't be called a real estate deal. Instead of one party buying land from another, it was the treaties were the point at which land became property in the U.S. property system. Another thing that makes it easier to understand when we understand that they were nation-to-nation agreements is retained indigenous rights to hunt or fish or use the land. Often these are presented today as special individual rights because the U.S. Is so individualistic. In fact, retained rights were collective rights retained by nations, even in their process of ceding territory to the U.S. They're not individual rights, they're national rights. The U.S. itself needed to cast these as nation-to-nation agreements. And that's because of the way that the U.S. property system is set up. In Supreme Court decisions that rest on principles such as the doctrine of discovery, the U.S. system was built along the lines that every property title in the country required extinguishing the rights of indigenous nations to occupy their own territory. Once that was done, the U.S. had a title to the land and could distribute it to settlers or corporations or even states. And it was that nation-to-nation agreement, not a corporation buying land, but the federal government only acquiring land from an indigenous nation, that created that transfer of title that is the basis of property in the U.S.